Okay, so to get the formal-ish part out of the way, welcome everyone to our, I think it's our 11th at home now. I was doing the calculations, goodness. It should be Lynn chairing today, and I want to thank her for setting up the wonderful papers that are coming your way. For various reasons that I won't dwell on because it's her information, she can't chair, but she has been incredibly efficient getting all the papers signed up, liaising with speakers, putting together a wonderful theme session around the idea of collectors and collections and the research joy that they inspire. And we have 3 wonderful speakers today, followed by another museum 5 minutes. So our first speaker is going to be Fiona McKelvie, then we have Caroline Ness, then we have Gill MacGregor. And each of their papers will be followed by the usual questions, which Anna, the question master, will be fielding for us. And you can pop them in the chat whilst you're listening to the presentations. And then at the end of those 3 papers, as I said, we have our Museum 5 Minutes, which is Sarah Nicol today, who's joining us from Leicestershire Museum Collections. So another treasure of a collection to be shared with us today. And we really hope you enjoy today's session. I'm going to stop speaking now and pass over to Fiona McKelvie, who I will now introduce, because enough of me and let's get more time for our speakers. So Fiona McKelvie is going to be talking to us about an inventory of linen, 1852 to 1929. She's had a career in textiles for more than 30 years, much of that time as export sales manager for Liberty's wholesale division. Originally from Belfast, she has a particular interest in Irish linen collecting since the 1970s. She's fascinated by the history and heritage of the industry and has spent many years researching the connections and legacy of Irish linen, flax and textiles. In 2013, she launched her website, mcburneyandblack.com, which we can pop in the chat for you. And it specializes in the sale of antique and vintage Irish linens, as well as vintage haberdashery. More recently, she contributed to the British Textile Biennial via the Cloth Cultures podcast with Amber Bouchard. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Fiona, for a wonderful paper, which I'm much looking forward to.
Hello, everyone. And hello from a linen mill in Northern Ireland. I'm actually over here on a short buying trip at the moment. I'm normally taking part in these things from Tooting in South London, but it's very good to be here. Lynn, thank you for inviting me, and let's have a look at an inventory of linen. Normally, I'm buying linen to either for my own collection or for sale through the website. But something cropped up on an auction site about 2 years ago, and it was an inventory of linen, a wonderful leather-bound book, which really piqued my interest. I couldn't wait to see what was happening inside. It's a beautiful volume, rather dog-eared nowadays, but has got some fascinating information inside it. The inventory was compiled by A.C. Thin, as you can see, Holmes Park, Inventory of House Linens made in 1852. Now, A.C. Thin was Anna Constantia, and she was the wife of the Reverend Lord John Thin, who was a canon and sub-dean of Westminster Abbey. And he had inherited the house from an uncle who had died childless in 1849. And on his death, Lord John became the 4th Baron Carteret. Now, here we have an image of the house on the left. It's now known as Haynes Park. It passed out of the family in 1910. It became a girls' boarding school for a number of years. And since about 1975, it's been home to an Indian religious group and still is today. But on the right, we see Anna Constantia with 2 of her daughters in an engraving taken from a portrait painted by Richard James Lane, which can be seen in the National Portrait Gallery. The book that she's compiled, and it would have been done with her housekeeper, is absolutely fascinating. It contains page after page of handwritten records of the linens in the house, some predating the start of the inventory. And the accompanying notes and remarks give us a wonderful glimpse into the linen cupboards of a house such as this in the second half of the 19th century, and the meticulous record keeping that accompanied the contents of those cupboards. I thought it might be useful to start with if you like, family tree of sorts, which demonstrates the marks and monograms which appear in the pages of the book. So the most common ones we see are GT, who was Lord George Thynne, who died in 1838. His two spinster sisters, Isabella and Caroline Thynne, I and CT. Then his brother, who was the third Baron Carteret, his cipher is a C with the Baron's crown above. And then below Lord John Thynne himself, his mother was an Isabella Byng of Rotham Park, married to the second Marquis of Bath, and her initials IT are also seen in the pages of the book. So here we have a typical page, sheets fine as opposed to sheets coarse, more of that later. So on the left, we have a column showing the date of the item, which would quite often have been marked on it, the number of pairs of sheets, then notes to accompany it, sometimes the cost, sometimes telling us what the color of the monogram is, then the monogram, if visible, then the length, and then the width. Now, the marking of linens in houses such as this would usually have been done by the housekeeper. And a typical mark would use the appropriate initials of the family, or would give the date, or would use a monogram. And also, if it was part of a larger set, it would show the number of pieces in the set. Now, I have one or two pieces in my collection at the moment which demonstrate this quite clearly. Here, for example, you have a tiny and discreet marking to one corner of a linen runner showing the date, 67, so 1867, and then initials and further initials to the bottom. And this is in tiny, tiny cross stitch. It was also common for them to be marked in indelible ink. And in this instance, you have the name, you have 1895, and the fact that this particular runner is 4 yards in length. Now, discreetly to a corner was the most common, but as you can see from this one, anything but discreet. This is absolutely magnificent. It comes from a European family, a German baron's estate. And here we can see that this particular cloth was number 3 of a set of 30. Now that wouldn't have meant tablecloths all of the same size. It would have referred to tablecloths, potentially runners, butlers' cloths that would have been of a similar design and could have made a much larger set. As well as being marked by the housekeepers, linens of this type could also be marked by the manufacturer before they were delivered to the clients. And this is a chart issued by Robinson and Cleaver of Belfast, also known as the Royal Irish Linen Warehouse, showing the styles of monogram that they would have done in the past, that they could do for their clients. And they noted at the top of the chart that every design was perfectly formed and worked in the finest manner. Now, Robinson Cleavers was one of the many stores in Belfast in the second half of the 19th century who were producing linens of the finest quality. This was the building they traded from, which is still in the centre of Belfast today. They occupied it from 1888. And at this time, Belfast was known as Linenopolis. It was the largest linen producing city in the world. And the city was buzzing with mills and workrooms producing some of the finest linen damask, linen sheeting, linen toweling, and then finishing and embroidering them for their clients all over the world. The pages of the Horns Park book show us a number of different manufacturers, and as well as monogramming, they would also have been asked on occasion to produce drawn thread details, and they would have the clients would have selected them from a sampler such as this. Two of the companies mentioned are Murphy and Orr of Belfast and James Lindsay and Company, both of whom were supplying the royal household. So it would have been perfectly feasible that they would have been supplying the fine houses of the country as well. And indeed, these two are both mentioned in the pages of our book. So here we see Murphy and Orr, Lindsay of Belfast. This page is opposite the listing of the fine sheets, and it actually shows us something quite interesting about how the linens in the house were looked after. The detail that we find on the pages tells us that these particular sheets were worn out. But when they were worn out, they weren't discarded. They were cut down. And on the opposite page, we see a listing for crib sheets and cot sheets. But here we can see that these were cut from large sheets from Rotherham Park, where Anna Constantia's in-laws lived. Very fine. Then we have cut from large old sheets, nearly worn out, very much worn in 1895, and so it goes on. So nothing was allowed to go to waste. This applied to table linens as well as to bed sheets. On the tablecloth page, we actually have an additional couple of columns on the listing so that it continues over to show us the number of people that might have expected to sit at a table graced by one of the cloths. So for example, a 4.5-yard tablecloth would be typical of a table that would seat 14 guests. But with these pages as well as the monograms, we come to the dates at the bottom of the page, and we have a listing here of 1798, showing 6 large sheets. And then if we continue, we find that the 2 largest were cut in half in 1904. So they'd already given 106 years of good service, and by 1904, it was deemed necessary that they be cut in 2 and repurposed. So recycling, certainly not a new concept. But the housekeeping and management of the linens of a house of this sort of size must have been a massive task. And as well as the care and maintenance of the linens, they also had to decide whether it would be repurposed, whether it would be mended. And the housekeeper and her team of helpers would have been well occupied. I recently came on this rather beautifully embroidered pillowcase. Now, the embroidery itself is stunning, but almost as beautiful, if not more beautiful, is the way in which it has been mended, and deemed important enough that the time and skill should be taken to turn it into a usable piece again. An entry in 1853 on the sheets page shows us that number 6 of a pair of sheets was very much scorched, the parts taken out and repaired with fine cloth. The poor laundry maid, whose attention strayed for a few moments, I imagine she was possibly punished for that crime. But linens were considered sufficiently precious that they were even being passed down through the generations. When Anna Constantia came to live in the house, there were already many linens there from previous relations. But the 2 spinster sisters of Lord George Thynne, who died in around the mid-1860s, when their house in London was cleared, the linens were moved to Haynes Park. So we have napkins and we have pillowcases, which were all moved to the other household. Here again, this is on the napkins page. So you see that 24 napkins were transferred from one home to the other. Today, in our own homes, we can probably only think of a few items of linen, really, possibly linen tablecloths, sheets and pillowcases, towels, perhaps a few tea towels, but nothing was quite that simple in 1852. From upstairs, we now move downstairs and we see sheets coarse as opposed to the sheets fine that we saw earlier. There were 6 pairs for men, 18 pairs for upper maids, 12 pairs for footmen. So these were meticulously listed. We see what the monogram and marking was, and they were obviously as important to the house as all of the fine linens above stairs. But to me, I think the most interesting one is when we come to the coarse cloths or kitchen linens. We have round towels, glass cloths, dusters, and so it goes on. All fully meticulously listed, counted, and marked with the master of the house. But I think when we look at something like this, you realize the extent and the sheer quantity of linen that would have been in a house such as this. So next time you unload your washing machine or tumble dryer, spare a thought for the laundry maids at Horns Park who cared for all of this linen without any of the machinery or modern equipment we have today. So perhaps the poor soul who scorched the sheets might be given a second thought and have our sympathy. When the house was finally it left family ownership in 1910 and was transferred over to a new ownership, the inventory book remained with the house. And the last entry is in 1929, and we have just 1 page and 6 lines showing a very reduced quantity of linen. So we can see how this type of life was dying out. The family were no longer involved with the home, and so it came to an end. Where this linen inventory was languishing between 1929 and 2020, I'm not too sure, but I think it gives us just a wonderful snapshot of what life was like in a country house at that time. So thank you for listening, and I hope you've found something interesting perhaps.
Well done, Fiona. Well done.
Okay, let's stop sharing. There we go.
Oh, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. You've shared so much information there, and in fact, quite a lot of questions have come in. So let's have a little look. So Veronica comments, what fascinating insights into the long life of linens. Would you say that researching this book has changed how you look at and interpret surviving linens from the period?
I think it does. It's not that often to come on the really old things now, but actually the piece that I showed you, the runner, I actually have one in the house here, which is never going anywhere because I use it, and you can see, I mean, the detail, and it's been so finely hemmed. And I think when you actually realize that the 93 on it dates to 1893, you really do begin to appreciate the longevity of linen. This has obviously had a life. There's a little bit of thinning in 1 or 2 places, but it's still just as usable as the day it was made. Sadly, not everything would, the more commonplace linens wouldn't necessarily have been marked in this way. So sometimes it's difficult to find an exact date. But when you do come across one, it's, there's a bit of a frisson of excitement. What can I find out?
Yeah, and you talk about these extraordinarily complex mends and that amazing sort of little envelope mend on the pillowcase, which is obviously a very precious item, so it kind of justifies a really time-consuming mend. Are there any mends that stand out for you?
I think probably that one that I showed in the photograph, because that wasn't the only one on one particular pillowcase. But I think what the book actually shows is that it was absolutely every single piece of linen was considered when it was worn out, as it says, it is then repurposed for something else, because you just don't see things discarded. They become smaller. So a large tablecloth cut down into 2 butler's cloths, or what they called a layover. So it certainly wasn't a case of, oh, I don't think we'll use it anymore. It was very consciously repurposed.
Does the book ever mention staining, or is that something that just is not to be recorded because that was the job of the people to get the staining out?
That was just the job of the laundry in the house. They would have had their own laundry within the house. And
sure. So Mackenzie comments that she was just mending her own grandmother's linen top sheet this morning.
Wonderful. I'm very glad to hear it.
And Lynn asks, do you know anything about the provenance of the volume after the house was no longer in the family? Did the salesman have any linens from the house to go with the volume?
Sadly not. It was on its own, and Chiswick Auctions couldn't tell me anything about it, unfortunately.
Wow.
But I just wonder, where on earth was it? I don't suppose it was in the girls' school. So who knows? May never be known.
Where does this stuff go?
Mm.
Who was it who did the categorization of the linens as being suitable for men or suitable for maids? How did that sit in the hierarchy of below stairs, or was it?
It would have been below stairs, and it would have been done by the housekeeper. I'm not quite sure why they actually did, make it as, what's the difference between a footman and an upper maid, I asked myself. But it is actually, I'm just quickly flicking through to see if I can see the size of whether there's any difference in the size of the sheets, and I don't believe there is particularly. No, it just mentions, it's not as though there's, maybe the upper maids were sleeping in smaller beds than the footman, but there's nothing that gives that away, unfortunately.
So it's just on the texture and the thread count and the fineness.
It's down to the fineness, I think, yes.
Okay.
In France, actually, I remember buying some linen some years back, and I was told that this rather narrow, very finely loomed linen was officers' grade linen. It had come from a military background, so obviously the officers got finer linen pillowcases than their men. So it must have been something of a similar nature, I imagine.
So Mackenzie writes that Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina has a similar quantity of family linens. Hannah's saying, why was the inventory so granular for the linen of all forms? Was it to do with foreseeing household expenditure, or did they worry it'd be stolen or sold? Which I think is really, really interesting question.
Linens used to be locked away. And if that's probably more 18th, very early 19th century, but they were locked away. And if linen was stolen from the house, that's it. You were out. It was very, very precious. But I think from this particular book, from what I can see, is that they do mention here's a toilet cover which cost one and sixpence. Yet it was still monogrammed. I mean, the fact that the toilet covers were even monogrammed. But yes, I think it was partly to do with budgeting, but also, something would maybe move from above stairs to below stairs. So when, even if it was of a fine quality, if it no longer had any good use left in it for the master and the family, then it could be moved to become a kitchen cloth, for example.
Would you say that comparatively the price of linen rises in the 19th century, or is it at its height in the 18th century? It's hard to do comparative.
It is. It was all hand woven. I mean, it was still being hand woven here in Belfast up until the 1960s, but only in a very small scale. But records, I would sometimes still find things that are in their original packaging with a price on it. And it's very hard to compare it to any pricing today, simply because of the sheer volume that was being produced. But it was always an expensive purchase.
Lots of comments coming in. Thank you so much for sharing. What a wonderful wealth of information in one little book. Thank you for doing all the decoding and the interpretation work, which is just incredible what you've done. So interesting. Kate asks, did the house have its own laundry, or were they outsourcing?
No, they would have had their own laundry. There's actually a National Trust property here called Castle Ward in Northern Ireland. If you ever get a chance to visit, they've actually recreated the laundry of the house. And, you see the huge quantity of irons, and, knowing I've read that line about the sheets being scorched, I can completely understand why these massive, very heavy iron presses that they were using. But apparently when these houses were being built, the laundry would be purpose-built in one wing, but the stable block would always be put as far away as possible. Because apparently it was the maids, the laundry maids, would distract the stable boys. I can't help feeling it may have been the other way around, but who knows?
Keep them separate.
Exactly.
Question, are there still companies that mark linens still?
Yes, there are. You can still get your linens monogrammed. very few nowadays, but it's certainly in the US, it's very widely available. Here in the UK, there's a bit of a return to that fashion. There's the monogrammed linen shop in Walton Street.
Cool. And have you come across the reason behind adding the date to the monogram in your records?
No, I think it's just something that was commonplace at the time. So perhaps again to do with an inventory of everything that was in the house and would have been part of the housekeeper's work.
Do you think that Anna Constantia was particularly meticulous? I mean, this strikes me as an extraordinarily detailed.
No, this would have been very common. But Anna Constantia was quite a gal, because she built the first stable and sustained marine aquarium and maintained corals and sponges in it for over 3 years. She was actually a marine zoologist.
Oh, that's so amazing.
So listing linens was probably something that was purely mundane for her, but
yeah, she was able to put all that systematic training and kind of scientific approach into household management.
yes, that's true.
Helen asks, can you tell us how we would or should launder old linen, please, especially what laundry products? Modern products seem so vicious and effective.
Okay, well, I can only speak for product in the UK because I know things are called different things in the US. But I would use generally something called Vanish, which is an oxy bleach, which is not as harsh. Definitely don't ever use bleach on old linens, and don't ever try and remove a rust stain, because actually a rust stain is iron salt. It's the residue of iron salt that hasn't been properly rinsed at the time. And if you try and rub it, it'll just go to a hole. So, but soaking in Vanish works most of the time. And if you're still left with a stubborn mark of some sort, then the next thing to try is lemon juice and sunshine. And it's hard to beat.
And Jackie raises the delicate subject of ladies staining and the monthly staining. Do you know how that was tackled?
I am afraid I don't know. I would presume probably soaking with hot water. Immediately it would be moved off the bed. But so generally things would have been soaked with this bluing, what was called bluing. But I think probably for that type of staining, it would have just been given a good soaking first of all, and then any residual marking.
So presumably women were using cut down of the sheets to form their monthly napkins.
Napkins, exactly, yeah.
At this point, Anna, and not because of the topic that was just introduced, I may have to move us on to our next speaker, just to keep things moving. We can still do questions in the chat. I feel like, and if we have time at the end, we will circle back to this, but just to keep things to time as close as we can.
Thank you.
Give everyone space. Fiona, thank you. What a wonderful paper. Well, I think, Anna, I'm going to take over there because we've got so much. We've had so much chat today. We are running slightly over time, but I will thank everyone for their patience, because we'll keep all the speakers with their allotted time and keep going. So Caroline, wonderful paper, and so kind of you to share like research in progress. We want this to be a space where papers don't have to be finished, and it can be, at a space to get information and share questions and share ideas. We really want that to happen, but we know that's quite a scary thing to do. So we really appreciate you doing that and sharing such a wonderful paper with us and such fascinating images. I'm now going to introduce our final official speaker for today, just before, so I'm going to pass over now to Gill MacGregor, who's going to be unlocking the wardrobe of Lady Ottoline Morrell. And again, it's another work in progress. So just to introduce Gill to you, Gill is currently a textile conservation display specialist or costume mounter at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. We can just see your notes at the moment, Gill, just to
sorry about that.
No, it's fine, it's quite fun. But she previously worked in theatre costume for 10 years, which is dear to my heart, before undertaking a master's degree in fashion curation at London College of Fashion in 2017, which is where her study of Lady Ottoline Morrell began. She's an avid researcher, and her interests include the display of unfinished or fragmented clothing, display solutions, and forgotten dressmakers. And we're going to have to get you back for another paper on that as well, I think. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to you. Thank you so much.
So thank you for the introduction. My name is Gill MacGregor, and I'm currently a costume mounter at the Victoria and Albert Museum, as Veronica said. And I'd like to thank the group for allowing me to speak today, because despite having been researching Lady Ottoline Morrell for around 5 years, this is actually the first time I've presented my research. I first came across her probably when I was around 11 years old, when I went to the Fashion Museum in Bath for the first time, which must have been just after they acquired the collection in around 2001. And they quoted her as saying, "Conventionality is deadness." And that really stuck with me. So many years later, when I needed to research a collection for my master's degree at London College of Fashion, I discovered that the collection had remained largely unstudied. So to briefly introduce the lady herself, she's an absolutely fascinating figure, and I could talk about her all day. She was born Lady Ottoline Violet Anne Cavendish Bentinck in 1873 and died in 1938 at the age of 65. She was a famed society hostess and artistic patron on the periphery of the Bloomsbury Group, with the likes of Augustus John, Henry Lamb, and Siegfried Sassoon amongst her circle. She married Philip Morrell in 1902, and they had one surviving daughter, Julian. She was known as a generous personality, but aside from her benevolence, she was also known as an unusual dresser. Virginia Woolf once referred to her as both a mermaid and, quote, like an armada in full sail, whilst Osbert Sitwell said she looked like, quote, an oversized Infanta of Spain. Others mocked her for her eccentricity, which was, quote, almost within the bounds of immorality. She had a difficult relationship with dress throughout her life, both loving it and feeling the guilt of excess of her sometimes expensive taste. In 1909, she mused on the historic styles of dress that she loved, that, quote, we still live in their homes and recite their poetry, but to wear their clothes is clearly a vanished art. Perhaps after all, I belong to the time of hoops and loops and billowing skirts, a rare survival. The collection at the Fashion Museum, Bath, consists of approximately 569 pieces, and it was acquired by the museum in 2000, direct from Ottoline's descendants. The collection is a mixture of garments, textiles, and accessories, predominantly belonging to both Ottoline, but with some pieces from her relations. Many of the garments are homemade and not always very well constructed, and several pieces show signs of extensive wear. When I first viewed the collection in 2017 as part of my master's, my sole aim was to photograph and document the garments in order to identify them within Ottoline's extensive collection of photographs, now within the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. In addition to the photograph albums, Ottoline also left a wealth of archival remains, including journals, diaries, letters, and guest books, which are all in the collection of the British Library, as well as 2 volumes of published memoirs. Ottoline was a dedicated diary keeper, and her handwriting is often difficult to decipher, as you can see from a sample on the right of the screen. And it's taken me many years to get around through about half of her journals. I also looked at secondary and tertiary sources, such as letters, diaries, and memoirs of her friends and acquaintances, and newspaper reports in which she was mentioned through the British Newspaper Archive. As part of my research, I was also fortunate enough to make contact with Ottoline's grandson, Adrian, who was instrumental in the sale of the collection to Bath, and who was able to enlighten me with wonderful tidbits about Ottoline from his mother, her only surviving child. Adrian and his wife, Sheena, also said that they'd try and join us today, so hello if you can. As Ottoline tended to dress in more fanciful and, in her own words, fantastic styles, many of which were homemade or unlabelled, it's difficult to provide many pieces with solid dates. For instance, the yellow bodice above was worn by Ottoline in a photo shoot with Cecil Beaton in 1927. However, it's obviously not of the style of the time. So by combining information from all of these sources, I was able to provide contextual information about pieces within the collection, and I'd like to share a couple of case studies with you. The first garment I was able to identify within photographs was this rather unusual purple velvet bodice with green tapestry sleeves. She was photographed in it by both Cavendish Morton in 1911 and Baron Adolphe de Meyer in 1912. Originally, the dress would have had a full skirt, but at some point this was cut away. I also came across this dress in a journal entry dated to March 31st, 1909, where she discusses going to sit for Augustus John, and he asks her to wear, quote, the purple dress with the green sleeves. As it stands, I've been unable to locate any sketches by John of her in this ensemble, but I am still looking. So one can deduce from this information that the dress was in active use between at least 1909 when she sat to John and 1912 when she was photographed in it by de Meyer. Next, this heavily damaged and repaired gauze blouse and skirt was able to be identified in several photographs in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. The earliest, from 1919, features Ottoline stood beside Lady Violet Bonham Carter, and you can see the unusual hem decoration clearly in the bottom of the picture. She also wears it in another image in her garden from the same year. We next come across the dress in 1926, where Ottoline's daughter, Julian, has dressed up in it as the Empress Eugenie and poses for a photo shoot with her mother. The dress is heavily repaired, suggesting that it was in use for a long time. Before beginning my studies, I'd always believed that Ottoline avoided fashionable dress, and indeed Juliet Huxley, who lived with her for a while, stated that her maid made most of her clothes, quote, never fully following the fashion of the day. However, the collection and her journals and diaries prove that this is not entirely correct. The image on the left shows Ottoline at Hampton Court Palace from her photograph albums, dated to 1909, and lists the friends whom she visited with. In her journals is a corresponding entry discussing her visit with her friends, where she states that she wore her, quote, smart buff Lucille coat. So one can deduce from this image that it features a coat by Lucille. And she frequented a number of other famous dressmakers of the day too. In the back of some of her earlier diaries, she lists owned pieces by Worth, Madame Hayward, Jay, Dreckel, Doucet, Callow, and a number of other brands, and discusses trips to see fashion shows at the likes of Poiret and Paquin. But not only that, Juliet Huxley also states that Ottoline had given her, quote, a discarded dress, a Venetian gown by Fortuny, stenciled all over with hundreds of small beads, worn under a grey voile sleeveless long tunic. Whilst we have no indication of what this may have looked like, and Ottoline doesn't seem to have been photographed in it, it goes to show that she did purchase dress from the fashionable makers of the day. There are also two pieces in the collection, as seen on the screen, which fashion auctioneers Kerry Taylor labelled as in the style of Fortuny. And other labels featured in the collection include Peter Jones, Molyneux, Maréchal, and Neil Roger. One reason for the lack of these items surviving in the collection is that Ottoline did give a lot of clothes away, especially when the family needed to downsize due to financial issues. She talks of selling some dresses in 1925 and again in 1928. In addition, Philip, her husband, gave pieces of clothing away to loved ones on Ottoline's death. Aside from these pieces, as Juliet Huxley suggested, there are lots of references in her journals to things being made by Ottoline's maids, and a lot of construction details do suggest that they were almost certainly not made by expert seamstresses or fashion houses. Moving on, by referencing newspapers through the British Newspaper Archive, I was able to learn a lot more information about Ottoline's public persona, and also managed to find this image, which I recognised immediately as a blue taffeta dress with Milanese tape lace collar from the collection. The dress was worn to a performance by the Salzburg Orchestra in April 1937 and has been accessorised with a large black bow and her traditional strings of pearls. Finally, one of the more exciting discoveries came from a mixture of sources. Two Spanish combs survive in the collection. The first, top left, is approximately 4 inches high, not including the teeth, and 8 inches wide. And the second, bottom left, is approximately 6 inches high, excluding the teeth, and 12 inches wide. Ottoline's grandson, Adrian, when transcribing the letters between Ottoline and Lytton Strachey, identified a reference to combs in a letter of April 9, 1920. Ottoline asked Strachey, who was in Spain at the time, to purchase her, quote, an imitation tortoiseshell comb, about a foot high. But in reading her journals, I came across a reference to Spanish combs and a performance by Spanish singer Raquel Mella on April 4, 1920, 5 days before she wrote to Strachey. She describes Mella's outfit in detail, quote, dressed all in black, a bright painted bodice and a full skirt with velvet bands on it, and a very, very tall comb, and a long black Spanish lace mantilla hanging down long behind. She seemed perfect. Newspapers then informed me that Mella was performing a solo in Albert de Courville's revue, Joy Bells, at the Hippodrome in London from April 1920, and I was able to locate an image of Mella in her costume, which you can see on the slide. Finally, the photograph albums provide an image dated to 1920, of Ottoline walking with her friends wearing a rather large comb and a black lace mantilla. This case study gives us an indication of Ottoline's influences in dress and how she went about procuring it. It isn't certain, of course, that these two combs were the ones purchased by Strachey, but the fact of their survival in the collection shows that they were sentimental items of hers. And that's all I have time for. But what this research shows is that by reuniting the separated material remains of Ottoline, her diaries, journals, letters, and photograph albums, plus information from the British Newspaper Archive, it's been possible to create a more complete picture of Ottoline's relationship to dress and tastes, whilst also providing context to pieces within the collection. Moving forward, I hope to be able to unlock many more secrets and continue to bring the life and dress of Ottoline back to life. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jill. Anna, are you ready to take on the questions?
I am. I'm just
Wonderful.
reading through them and seeing what sort of shape they
Yeah.
are. Okay, so Veronica says, it's wonderful to see how these garments perform on canvas and in photograph, dressing up in every sense. And you've uncovered so many, Jill. It's difficult to know. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. It's difficult to know where to start, really. Is there a standout discovery? Is there something you found that you think really gets you closer to this fascinating?
I think every little
person?
bit kind of contributes to it, really. I think finding out a bit about the combs and finding out that she'd actually seen a performance before, you know, asking her friend to get some for her, that was a little bit of a eureka moment. But kind of all of them really contribute to more understanding about her.
But you've been doing this for 5 years.
Yes, sort of on and off. It's quite a lot of work, and her journals are very intense when you actually get around to reading them.
What sort of intense?
I think she was quite a depressed individual, and she often sort of mourned into her diaries, and there's a lot of sort of personal information, but you've got to sort of plough through those to get to the bits that are more relevant to her dress. They're absolutely fascinating documents.
And does she talk about the different, I don't know, performative personas that she played out in her clothing? Does she give any sort of written insights into what she's doing and why she's doing it?
Absolutely. She very often she talks about having to play a part to everyone. There are so many theatrical references that she puts in her diaries, and you know how she's on the stage, how she's wearing her mask, sort of thing. And she takes so many influences from things that she sees on stage as well, as seen by Nora Mellor's costume. And she constantly mentions going to see the Ballet Russe and saying, like, the colours of the sets, the oranges and reds are deep within my heart, sort of thing. So I don't know that she necessarily had personas per se, but she was very much playing a single role to everyone.
So Kim's asking whether there's a relationship with aesthetic dress in the 1880s and aestheticism. Have you come across any evidence for this?
Not specifically. I think she much more referenced kind of portraits of people from in sort of historic styles, but I am very well aware of the sort of historic dress, and I think there's references to shopping at Liberty and things like that.
Interesting. Lou points out that in the photograph of her as a child, she seems to be wearing a Romanian blouse that was quite a recognised alternative vogue at the turn of the 20th century.
She has a lot of foreign dress, actually. Some of her acquaintances talk about her having dress-up boxes or dressing in her Persian gowns. So she did wear a lot of clothing from the continent. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was a sort of Romanian style.
And there's lots of, please go further, please publish, please write a book, please do a PhD. You've given us a little taste of this fascinating character, but she kind of straddles so many different issues and discourses at this moment in time. She's fascinating.
She's brilliant.
Kate's asking, do any of Ottoline's garments exist elsewhere, or is it just Bath, the collection?
Her family have kept a few bits back from the acquisition that I'm aware of, because she did give so much away. I'm always wondering if I'm going to come across something one day. but I've not found anything yet.
Okay. Lou's just following through on Bloomsbury and saying, I'm sure that Jill will know this. Wendy Hitchmock, sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong, Hitchmock, sorry. In her ace book, The Bloomsbury Look, writes very well about Morrell's relationship with the Bloomsbury group and the Omega dress style. So there's some in there. Miranda Seymour wrote a really interesting biography of Lady Ottoline, that comes from Lynn. And Marie puts in sometimes an uncomfortable relationship. And I don't quite...
She certainly had a very uncomfortable relationship with the Bloomsbury group. I'd sort of describe them as frenemies.
Hmm. Diane saying, PhD in the making, your research methods are excellent and it should be excellent. This work is pursued, it should be pursued.
Thank you. There's plans afoot.
Excellent.
I'm going to jump in there because I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and you can just see, Jill, the appetite for more from you, and do come back if you discover more things. We're very happy to have further presentations on a related theme from people who've spoken to us before. We love to hear how research develops and progresses. And thank you. That was, as you can tell, I think you're getting the sense that people very much enjoyed your paper. It went down well. We now move to our final speaker for today, Sarah Nicol, who is featuring as part of our Museum 5 Minutes series and will be sharing some treasures with us from the collection that she works with, which is the Leicestershire Museum Collections. As you'll discover, or you may already know, they hold the Symington collection of corsetry that contains a large selection of 19th century underwear, but not quite so well known or advertised as the large selection of dresses from every decade of the 19th century, along with accessories and equestrian wear. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sarah, and let you introduce us to or share more of the Leicestershire Museum Collections. And thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. See if I can get my technology to work.
It's working. Great, looking good.
Thank you. Hello everybody, and welcome to my little conversation, or my show and tell, about Leicestershire museum collections. As Veronica said, my name's Sarah Nicol, and I'm the curator for the collections engagement across all of the collections. But I'm here to talk about my favourite, and by far I think one of the most studied, which is the costume archive. I did want to talk to you today from the frock box, but unfortunately the council have chosen this weekend to do some computer upgrades. So I am from home, but I have managed to bring 2 capes with me, which are in the background here. So the red one is from around 1820, and then the brown one here, which is from about 1860. So if I could just give you a little background into the collections and what we do. We have 3 museums in the county that we look after, which are Charnwood Museum in Loughborough, the Symington Building in Market Harborough, and the Carnegie Museum in Melton Mowbray. We try and have a little of costume in both the permanent and the temporary collections, exhibitions. The images that you see here were temporary exhibitions that weren't about costume, but I did manage to get some garments of ours represented. We also loan to community groups and other museums. 2 of our Dior dresses were borrowed by the V&A for their Dior exhibition in 2019. And the V&A Dundee have one of our 1930 Speedo swimsuits on display in their gallery. And some of our utility garments were on loan to both the Imperial War Museum North and South for their Fashion on a Ration exhibition. We feel this is extremely important for our collections, that our collections are seen and studied by as many people as possible, and not just the people that can visit us in Leicestershire. Our collection archive spans from around 1750 through to the present day and numbers over 20,000 pieces of costume, including underwear, dresses, separates, coats, women's and men's tailorings, handbags, hats, shoes, fans, you name it, we've probably got one of it. Made up of designer wear to high street to homemade, the archive helps to give a glimpse into the lives of ordinary people. We hold the Next archive for Next PLC and also have a large selection of Wallace coats, together with their original designs from the 1980s and early 1990s that were donated by Sylvia Ayton. If you've heard of the Leicestershire Museum collections, then it is more than likely it would be in connection with the archive and of R&WH Symington and Co Limited. Symingtons were a corsetry manufacturer based in Market Harborough, Leicestershire. They were a mass manufacturer of corsetry, foundation wear and swimwear from around 1860 through to May 1990, when they finally finished trading. The corsetry archive is beautiful and is by far the most studied collection that we hold, with corseteers, researchers and students coming from across the world to study the corsets in minute detail, learning about construction techniques, fabrics and internal supports. But less well known is our collection of 19th century dresses and accessories. We have over 250 garments dating from the 19th century, from fichus, crinolines, bustle cages, dresses to jackets, capes and mantles, and a few pairs of shoes. The collection is made up of donations from local people. Some are dresses that were remembered by the donors as dressing up costumes from their childhood, or garments that have been kept by distant relatives, but the knowledge of whom wore them, unfortunately, has been lost. Some have been altered over time to keep up with the fashionable shape or used for theatre or fancy dress, but each garment has its own story. You just have to look. Our collections have featured in books by Pan Inda and Gill Salon. They have been studied by fashion designers and costume makers for film, TV and theatre. We're proud to have a collection that can be handled, photographed and examined in every detail. You can see the insides of the garments in order to study the construction. You can see and feel the different fabrics that have been used to mount, line and support the garment. Things that when the item is mounted and behind glass cannot be seen. We started to have visitors back in September. However, this has been at a reduced capacity, but we are hoping to reopen to both volunteers and visitors in the new year, fingers crossed and COVID willing. The collections are available to view and study in detail, and yes, you can touch. They are available to draft patterns from or to just come and have a look. They're open to anybody with an interest in design, fashion, or just a love of anything historic. It's easy to make an appointment. You can either call or email me with the details that are on the screen, and we can organise a day. Appointments are normally either a morning or an afternoon, but if you want a longer appointment in order to study items in depth, then that can be arranged. If it's a 1 hour visit or a week-long visit, we can accommodate you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, so I'm just looking in the chat at the questions. So Veronica's kicked off by putting in a couple of links to Leicester museums and images from the Symington corset collection. And Lou Taylor asks, were these utility, etc. clothes once part of the so very sadly missed Snibston Discovery Park Fashion Gallery, once so beautifully curated by Philip Warren?
Yes, they are, Philip. Yes, it still has something to do with it as well. Yes, they are. And everything that was in the Fashion Gallery at Snibston is in the archive that I look after. It did come from the Collections Resources Centre, and when it came off display, it came back. But unfortunately, yeah, we don't have anywhere that we can display costume to a large extent anymore. But yeah, it is available to study, so we just have to work it in a different way.
So when were those things transferred into your care?
Well, they always were. I looked after them when they were at Snibston as well.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I wondered, Anna, I didn't put it in the chat, I'm cheekily jumping in, but you said it's available to study. Just students or research, they come, where do they go? Where are you, where are they coming to get to you?
I'm based at the Collections Resources Centre, which is in Barrow-on-Soar.
Okay.
Which is in Leicestershire. So yeah, it's an industrial building, but that's where we keep the collections, and that's where you can come and have a look. The only drawback really is that I don't have a lot of space, so it is small groups.
But no, wonderful that you can accommodate people, and they just write to you at the address you provided with an outline of what they are interested in seeing. And
yeah, and then we can go from there. But I will always get things out when they're there as well. So sometimes it's certainly students are not sure what they want to see if they've just started, with their studies and with a project. So yeah, when they're there, I will go and fetch more things out, and it's not a problem.
Sounds wonderful. And have any more questions come through, or is it mainly statements?
No, it's mainly comments like, oh, wonderful. So glad that we can still study these things. Thank you so much. That was a lovely insight into your collection. Thank you, thank you. It's amazing it's still accessible. I've been lucky enough to visit the collection. It's brilliant. Thank you. And Diane just says, can you just repeat the location where you're based?
Yeah, it's Barrow upon Soar, which is near Loughborough in Leicestershire.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think because we are running slightly over time, I am going to start drawing things to a close, but I feel like, Sarah, you've definitely shown me far more than I realized existed in your collections. Like so many people, I didn't think it was just the corsets, but that's where I'd encountered your collection before. So to know there's that wider portfolio of objects available, and also that you are so open to hosting such a range of researchers is incredibly useful, because I think certain collections are more suited to the kind of research you talked about, where people are looking for patterns and construction details than others. So the fact that you are so open to that style of research is really useful to know as a lecturer with students who will be lapping that up. So thank you so much for joining us today, and all our other speakers as well. It's been, as you can tell from the time it's taken, it's been such a fascinating day. I do want to thank Lynn again, because she did all the heavy lifting to pull this program together, to get these speakers on board, to persuade some of the more reluctant presenters, who all did a fantastic job, to join us, and their research was valid and incredibly interesting. And to join us today at moment's notice is above and beyond the call of duty, Lynn. So thank you so much for making this happen. We normally have our at-homes at the end of the month, but I want to let you know that our final at-home of the year is actually going to be on December the 12th. So that's a date for your diaries. And it's actually a far more, well, it's always informal, but it's a particularly informal session on December the 12th. It's going to be called a winter soiree. And Robin Calvert will be our main host on that day. And we are running sort of drop-in activities and chats and quizzes and Christmas-themed and costume-themed activities between 1 p.m. GMT and 3 p.m. GMT. The reason we've chosen that time slot is if Australians and New Zealanders stay up late enough, they can just about catch that first hour. And we figured by drifting into that 3 p.m. time slot, we could get a few early risers up in America and Canada. And people in the UK, you have no excuse. You have to be there the whole time because it's fine for you. No, just come as and when you can. Bring a Christmas themed accessory or costume should you wish from any era. It's optional, but you're very welcome to do so. The Eventbrite site is already up and running, so I'll actually pop that link into the chat now if I can make it work. Try and talk and pasting to the chat is a challenge for me, but I think I can just about do it. And we will circulate it online through our social media and through the mailing list as well. So don't worry if you don't catch it right now. We will send it round. I also want to remind everyone in the audience that we are looking for speakers for next year, and we would love to hear from you if you have an idea, and also anyone working with the museum collection. We are really enjoying in these Museum 5 Minutes and finding out about even collections we already know, material we didn't know they held, and how to access it, and how willing curators are to make that accessible and share it with this wide audience. So please do get in touch with us either at, through our email address, which I will share on a slide shortly, or through social media. Any way you want to get in touch is absolutely fine. We just love hearing from you. There we go. Boom, here we go. Twitter, Facebook, email address, whatever works for you. We would really just love to hear what you're doing. We really do hope you've enjoyed today. I'd like to end with a final thank you for our speakers. So if you want to show your appreciation either through the sort of reaction symbol or just clapping in the air, please do. And then I will let you all go because it's been an overlong session, but an absolutely fascinating one. So thank you so much for joining us.